Hi, everybody. Thanks again for being here. I'm Ryan Howzell. I work with the Ethics in Journalism Initiative, where, among other things, I manage the Collier Awards. So it is so wonderful to have you here for the final official event of the Collier Awards, which is this last panel on ethically covering and working with vulnerable populations. I was really privileged to moderate a similar panel that we hosted last year on the same theme, and we try to make it a part of every symposium we have because we think sourcing in a way that is sensitive and inclusive and allows us to be better reporters on a diversity of communities is incredibly important and is such a hallmark of ethical journalism. So I am so lucky to have an incredible panel of journalists here. I'm going to briefly introduce them and then we'll dive straight into their work. So right here we have John Schuppe. He's on the NBC News team that submitted Dealing the Dead, which was a story on individuals who passed away and then had their body parts donated or sold without the consent and often without the knowledge of their families. John is a reporter on NBC News' Enterprise team, where he focuses on criminal justice issues and investigations. Right next to him is Liz Kreutz. Liz is an NYU journalism alum, which is very exciting, and also an award-winning journalist with NBC News based in LA. Next to them, we have Jean Rimbach and Ashley Balcerzak, who are from the Bergen Record in North Jersey. Jean is a longtime award-winning senior investigative reporter at The Record. Her work has explored a broad range of topics, from misspending in public preschool to corruption behind illegal driver's license. Ashley focuses on housing and inequality, the state house, elections, budget, among other topics, and their submission, Hidden at Home, explored the experiences of New Jersey group home residents who face neglect, abuse, and other failures of the system. And then at the very end, we have Nate Rosenfield and Mukta Joshi. They're here representing Mississippi Today and the New York Times for their joint investigation into the Rankin County Jail and the abuse of inmates, and also the use of inmates as enforcers to deploy further abuse on inmates. So I am just so lucky to have this group. I mentioned my email I sent to them ahead of time that I found, a lot of in their submissions, people submit not only their published work, but also their reflections on their work, and a lot of overlap in the reflections on how this whole group addressed approaching the really unique populations that they were working with. So I'm really excited for what's sure to be an incredibly fruitful conversation. We also have Bella with the question mic, similar to Steve. I welcome questions throughout. So if someone said something that you would love to hear more about or dig deeper into, please just raise your hand and we'll get you the question mic. I think it's really beneficial when this is pretty interactive, and sometimes we'll move on from a topic and you have a question, so I want to make sure we can kind of cultivate that conversation. So this panel, the title is Ethically Covering and Working with Vulnerable Populations, and there's a lot of overlap in that verbiage, but also some distinction. So I wanted to start with the idea of covering. So how you choose your subjects and how you chose these specific stories. I know for some, they grew out of past beat reporting that they were doing, or that you all were doing. So I was wondering if you could just briefly, and maybe we'll go down the line and we'll start with John and Liz and then make our way to Mukta and Nate, talk about how you found these stories and how you decided to explore them in the specific way that you did, and any reservations you had about kind of subject matter area, or also any excitement, just basically your initial thinking about these stories.
This, just as you said, our project, Dealing the Dead, that focused on a medical school in Texas, began for us with an investigation that began in Mississippi, actually. I got a tip that from a mother of a man who went missing, and she spent months looking for him, and eventually discovered that even though she had put in a missing persons report to the local police department, the Jackson Police Department, they had buried him as an unclaimed body in the pauper's grave behind the jail, the Hinds County Jail. And she came to me. I had interviewed her for an unrelated story a couple months earlier, and she came to me with the story. Obviously, it sounded compelling, and we ended up doing that one story. And that led to more stories of more families whose family members had also been buried in this pauper's grave, deemed unclaimed, even though they had families who would have claimed them or were looking for them. That led us to explore whether this type of thing was happening elsewhere in the country. And one of the places that one of my colleagues, Susan Carroll, found was she got a tip that this was happening in a different form at the University of North Texas. So that shifted us the following year, after that whole cycle of the investigation in Mississippi, to exploring the use of unclaimed bodies by this medical school. Was there another part to your question?
And
Or
when
maybe I'll
you,
just
I
move
guess,
it down the line.
yeah, move it down the line. But the additional thing was, as you realized, oh, this is the story that we're going to tell. Did you have concerns? Do you have reservations? Did you feel kind of prepared to dive into the investigation that you ultimately ended up pursuing?
Well, I think with our reporting here, there was an aspect of it, like on its surface, when you hear that unclaimed bodies from Dallas and Tarrant counties were going to the University of North Texas Health Science Center. The idea is, okay, these are unclaimed people. They died. They didn't have anybody to claim them. They were sent to this medical center where they were going to be used for this great purpose, medical training and research. Like, that's great. We need people to donate their bodies. We need cadavers for medical schools. But there was this sort of feeling like there was something off here. And there was a source that we had in Dallas who was a bioethicist who was sort of like feeding, a little bit of information about like something didn't feel right. I think we had that journalistic feeling like something didn't feel right. And Susie, John, and the team did public records requests and FOIAs, and ultimately it was like thousands of pages of documents to pore over to realize, oh yeah, something isn't quite right. Because ultimately the county was saying that these bodies were unclaimed, but what we learned is that they weren't necessarily unclaimed. They were unclaimed because you made one phone call to a defunct phone number and couldn't find their loved one. One of the women we interviewed, whose ex-husband, who she shares children with, was died on the streets of Dallas. His body was frozen, deemed unclaimed, sent to the medical center, frozen, chopped up, and body parts shipped out for profit to different medical centers or different for-profit medical training centers across the country. She said, how could they not find me? NBC found me in a day. It took a Facebook message to her and wrote back right away. And so I think that's sort of like if you have that feeling and you keep digging and you find it, and that's kind of like on the surface, unclaimed, but not really unclaimed. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'll move on to Jean and Ashley. How did this story emerge as something you realized you were going to focus on? I know last night you mentioned this was a year plus long investigation, and when you realized you were going to be working with these families and also these disabled adults, how did you feel as you were approaching the investigation? Did you feel prepared? Did you have reservations? What was your thinking there?
Well, our story started with us looking at one group home, and that's where all of the focus was. And then and seeing and
we can hold it a little closer.
The abuses we saw there, the deaths, we started to think that this could just be happening here. Mm-hmm. And in branching it out, looking at lawsuits against every group home in New Jersey, researching each one, there's about 130 and the companies that are operating in the state, and reaching out to parents, developing sources both within the state and within the community of the developmentally disabled. We started to hear the same stories over and over again, the same deficiencies, the same lack of basic care, deaths that could be prevented, people running into traffic, choking because there wasn't any training to prevent choking, being really just left alone to die. Either the staff, in one case, the young man who had autism was supposed to be checked on every 15 minutes, and when we researched and looked at all the reports from the medical examiner's office and the police, we could see he wasn't checked on for at least 9 hours before he was found dead in his room. So it was one of those things that it just started to, grow, and you couldn't put it down. Ashley?
Working with the sources, I think, was a challenge as well. Like, what we found was it was pretty easy to start finding families. Like, once we spoke to one person, they'd refer us to another, and it was very, I think, cathartic to them to like finally have someone to listen. But a lot of the times they did not want to put their name on the record. And obviously the more people we talk to and we seeing these themes, it's very important. Like, every single conversation is important, but it takes a lot of time and trust to get people to go on the record and to understand what those consequences are, and make the informed consent and speak with the residents themselves, and like hearing their experiences and how they feel when they were traumatized or given the wrong medication or felt disrespected. So that was kind of a learning curve, I think. Like, they're really, really heavy, long, hours-long conversations, like understanding, like, from the first moment that they realized their child had a disability to a really horrible traumatic event. So that took a lot of time and patience and understanding, I think.
And we'll move to Mukta and Nate to answer this first question, but so much there, Ashley, that we're going to explore in the rest of the conversation, from anonymity and on the record to just how you approach the interview and just the emotional toll, but also kind of journalistic obligation. So excited to get more into that, but we'll start with, we'll finish with Nate and Mukta on the first question of, how did you figure out that this was the story you were going to be reporting, and, what were any challenges or reservations you kind of anticipated from the beginning?
Yeah. It was a very long journey to get to the story. Our team had been reporting on this sheriff's department, the Rankin County Sheriff's Department in Mississippi, since 2023. We'd unearthed that a group of deputies there, some of whom called themselves the Goon Squad, had been systematically torturing drug suspects for decades, waterboarding them, burning them, strangling them in order to get them to turn informant or give them information to make further arrests. And this reporting helped lead to a Justice Department investigation. A core group of the deputies involved were sentenced to decades in federal prison. But we knew coming out of it that there was much more to the story that we hadn't uncovered yet. One of the really key leads we got was we were able to get members of this core group of deputies who are now in federal prison to speak to us about their experience. And they started to tell us that the abuse was much more extensive, that it went much further than this core group, and that it had spread beyond the patrol deputies into the jail that the sheriff's department runs. They told us about several allegations of corruption and brutality in the jail, and we knew that that was the area where we wanted to focus. And our team split up and covered it in multiple aspects. We did a story that Mukta and our colleague Steph spearheaded that was about the sheriff using trustees, which are inmates who are given special privileges in order to, because they're trusted and they're willing to participate in this program. They were using those inmates allegedly as free labor on the sheriff's chicken farm, along with taking county property to use on the farm as well. And then we also worked on a piece that showed that inmates in the jail had been brutalized in a similar manner to what we'd seen out on the street, where if they broke the rules or, sometimes it seemed to be just a matter of wanting to humiliate them. They said that they were beaten by guards, administrators, and even other inmates, trustees, under the direction of guards. We talked to, I think between the two stories, we talked to like over 100 probably sources in the jail, as well as former deputies and guards, people who had witnessed the abuse, experienced it, or participated in it themselves. And when we were setting out to do this, I know one of the really big challenges is we knew from our past reporting, this was a terrifying prospect for our sources to talk to us. These people, in our past stories, they had told us about their literal torture and told us that deputies had said to them, well, there's worse for you if you ever speak about this to anybody. So getting them to feel that they could trust us with their stories was an enormous barrier to overcome. There was also the struggle in these stories of trying to deal with gathering records and talking to people who are incarcerated, where there are so many barriers to access. And in addition to that, this trustee program was one that we learned very quickly. A lot of the participants in it had strong connections to it and were very deeply embedded in the sheriff's department. And so figuring out, where people's allegiances lay, who was going to be open, who you could trust, all of these things were really challenging, but primarily dealing with the safety concerns of, getting our sources to talk to us in a way where, we could try to prevent retaliation from the department.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add one thing to Nate's last point about where people's allegiances lay. And I think while we were reporting on the chicken farm story, we quickly realized that because of the privileges and perks that these trustees were receiving, they felt so loyal and indebted to the sheriff. And even them being used as free labor on his family's chicken farm, like when they were doing a lot of this stuff, like when they were helping jail guards enforce discipline in the jail, or when they were working for like a private business, they didn't feel like it was wrong. In some ways, some of them said that they really enjoyed the opportunity to like get out of the jail for a while and like spend time with like other fellow inmates. And at the end of this work, that they'd get treated to like cookouts and burgers. And of course, like when you're in jail, like when you're in jail and eating jail food, like that's a big deal. And especially about the inmates who said they participated in the violence. I mean, it was a big deal that they were talking about their own involvement in causing harm to other inmates. But I actually, in some cases, I feel like as they spoke to us, initially they were coming from a place of, they were talking about it because they didn't think it was wrong. But I think as our reporter source relationship grew, I think like through that questioning, I think some of them like really reflected on the morality of it, and some of them felt used, and I think that really impacted the way in which they were sharing information with us.
Absolutely. I think one of my favorite things about all of your reporting is just how nuanced and multifaceted the final stories are. I think, you of course spoke to inmates, but you also spoke to deputies, and you also, you spoke, Jean and Ashley, you spoke to these families and these adults, but you also spoke to these disabled adults and residents, but you also spoke to the workers. And I think, those complicated, complex stories, it's such a reflection of the depth of your sourcing. And I think, your team as well, your investigation took you all around the world. You extended beyond the US. You were in Venezuela. You were, I remember there's the man who was involved in the body trade who was based in Las Vegas and had a slightly different story than the medical center. And so just the diversity of sources was incredibly impressive. Something a couple of you mentioned is the fact that in most of your cases, you were interviewing people with, significant risk, maybe legal risk, maybe a risk of job loss. I know you mentioned this, Jean and Ashley, when you're speaking to employees of these group homes, and how building trust was difficult because of this risk. And I was just wondering for the group, you could talk about how you navigated the fact that you were talking to people who had significant risk, and you as journalists can't necessarily protect them. But also, you have a personal interest in them sharing their story and going on the record. So just wanted to, we're all going to be encountering people who have risk, and just what worked, what didn't, how did you approach that? Maybe we'll start with Ashley.
I think understanding the risk and fear was helpful first off. Like, why was someone afraid of something, of speaking to us? Were they afraid of retaliation by employees, by their employer? Were they involved in a lawsuit? Had they settled? Had they signed an NDA or a non-disparagement agreement? Were they afraid that their loved one would not be able to find another group home to take them because they were afraid that the family would be troublemakers? So first, understanding what the fear was and where it was coming from, then we could kind of discuss, here are the different risks, options, good things that could happen from it. The number of times we said, like, we're not lawyers, but like we can walk through this with you. I've lost count. Working with lawyers was really helpful on that end too. Like we kind of like, there were so many different situations. Some lawyers like went through, they said, oh, there's actually no agreement here. Yes, we can like connect you with our family this way. Others would say, we can't let you speak to them, but here's a document that we can give you. So it was helpful working with like the representation that they had as well.
One thing that I would add to that is there's like another level of risk too for a lot of these families, especially the ones who have had children that have died because of what's happened at these facilities. We're asking them to reopen a wound, to go back to a place that some of them have made peace with or found a way to make peace with, and I know that for some of the people that we interviewed, not only did they really have to, some of them had to really think about it, and we had to keep going back to them. And some of them spoke to us, and it became very stressful for them. And they would, I can think of a couple of people who flew off the handle a few times and then came back to us, But you had to understand where they were coming from, that they had lost somebody, and they had lost them in a terrible way, and they hadn't gotten justice for it. So.
Yeah, and I want to get to you, Nate and Mukta, but just speaking of the kind of reopening a wound, it made me really think of your reporting, John and Liz, and how in these cases maybe you were returning to families who hadn't known what happened to their loved ones for years, and maybe there wasn't necessarily a legal risk or like a physical risk, but I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, I know, John, last night you talked about, sharing the news that a relative had passed, but just how you prepared for and approached having to have these really difficult conversations, whether you were revealing new information or also just revisiting really painful details with interviewees.
For Dealing the Dead, we settled on one main character named Victor Honey, who was an Army veteran who suffered from mental illness, became estranged from his family, including his children, and ended up leaving this sort of peripatetic lifestyle where he ended up where he was from. This is based in Dallas, but he ended up back where he was from in Ohio. They ended up in D.C., on the streets in D.C. He became homeless. He was mentally ill. He often refused the treatment. He robbed some banks along the way and made his way finally back to the streets of Dallas, where he was actually in the city where his now ex-wife and adult children were homeless in a wheelchair, and that's the circumstances in which he died. And they didn't know about it. That's a long way of saying that once Liz and I and the rest of our reporting partners went to sort of explore that story, not only approaching them and telling them what had happened, but I found myself personally dealing with some difficult family dynamics because, for instance, we had Kimberly, who is Victor's ex-wife. The breakup of their marriage was under terrible circumstances. She didn't hold much of a grudge and was open to us talking. But her children, her adult children, Victor's kids, really had some hard feelings about the way that they grew up. And that was a piece that was unexpected for us, to have to navigate how to tell the story and who to include, because the kids were arguably the most damaged by everything, and they were less willing to talk to us, and it was a constant set of negotiations, if you will, to see how far we could push without being disrespectful about how they wanted to participate. So I was trying to think about how to answer your question, and I brought myself back to those family dynamics, which are really hard, and how much of the sort of skeletons in a family's past, how much that family is willing to dredge up again and acknowledge publicly for the world in the pursuit of telling the story.
Well, and another element of that, and we had an added layer at times because our work was a mix of a sort of a long text piece, but then also a 4-part broadcast series on nightly news. And so we had another element of, in order to do this for nightly, we needed these people to also go on camera, which is another element of it. And so you have to be vulnerable and willing to have a TV crew come into your home and in many cases cry on camera. And so that took a lot of effort as well to build those relationships, and the rapport were ultimately, some were willing to do that, but that also then shaped which people we ended up really highlighting in the series. But what we also found was just this level of shame that a lot of people had, which made it harder for them to want to come forward, because it's easy even hearing this reporting to be like, well, how could you, like, okay, if you really cared about your loved one, like, why were they even so hard, like, why were they unclaimed in any way? But it was because it's family dynamics. People, just because you're estranged from your brother or your father doesn't mean you don't love your brother or your father. But people had this fear that the public, seeing them come speak, would judge them for that. Right. And were fearful of that. But thankfully, there were some that ultimately decided that, like, the anger they had for what happened to their loved one was enough for them to overcome that and speak out.
I appreciate you just talking about, these complex family dynamics. I think that what, again, shown about all of your stories is we can talk about vulnerable communities broadly, but none of these communities are monolithic, and I feel like you get that diversity of it. And Nate and Mukta, I just wanted to bring back the question of legal risk and potential other risk to your sources, and how you spoke with them and had them in some cases go on the record when you can only promise so much, and just how you navigated that.
Some of them were, for good reason, really terrified. There were a number of people who said if we were ever to meet for an interview that it couldn't be in Rankin County, because they said that after they got out of jail they just stopped, they just moved elsewhere. Some of them also worked at the sheriff's department after they got out of jail. Like one of the perks of the trustee program was you develop this like intimate relationship with the sheriff and jail administrators, and they would hire you after you got out. And that is also a big deal because of how hard it usually is for people to be employed after they get out of the criminal justice system. And one example comes to mind where we reached out to a former trustee who was working at the sheriff's department running their kitchen. And the first time we interviewed him, he was like, yeah, the trustee program is great. He told us all about like the special pod where the trustees lived, all the perks that they got. He was able to adopt a dog while he was in jail, which was like a common theme that we found. And he spoke so glowingly of the sheriff. He talked about how this trustee program was the sheriff's legacy, and that's what everyone knew him for. And then after our first story came out, we got another. And also, after we had this interview, I kept texting him to, follow up and get some more information. At one point, he responded saying, I want to cancel. And I was like, okay, I guess, he works there. He doesn't want to talk to us anymore. And then after the first story came out, we got an email from him saying he wanted to talk to us again. And this time, when we met him, he said that he'd been fired. And we never really, we weren't ever able to corroborate the exact reason why he got fired. But he said after he spoke to us and went back to work, he was really admonished by the guards there. And he felt so weird about that because he was like, but I didn't even say anything bad. And that coupled with everything else, and in that interview, the information really came tumbling out about all this stuff he was expected to keep secret for them. And I think, just the power that law enforcement officers have, especially in a sheriff's department where the sheriff is so powerful that he'd been unopposed in the past 4 elections. So it was really, really challenging, kind of dealing with those conflicts. But I think ultimately we were able to, just by a sustained conversation and really following up with people and just maintaining a consistent relationship, even when they fell off the grid. A lot of people in who have to deal with the criminal justice system, they have a lot going on. Like their family situations, like they can be really complicated. They don't always come from like really, really secure families. They really grapple with poverty. They're in and out of they're in and out of prison a lot, and it's you just have to keep texting them. And I think them being able to see that we cared enough to be persistent also eventually got them to respond and share information with us.
Definitely. Yeah, Nate?
Yeah, I'll add too. I think one of the most challenging cases we had, and one that we learned a lot from, involved this source named John Phillips, who he was a trustee. When we started talking to him, he was an inmate at a state prison, and we were talking with him by letter and then over the phone. And he was an incredible source. He had an incredible memory. He was a great storyteller, and he had seen so much. He was a maintenance trustee for quite a while, at kind of a key time in many of the allegations that we saw. He said that he had participated in the abuse and witnessed it, and he was willing to go on the record about it. And crucially, he also was one of our witnesses for a really key incident that involved another trustee who had escaped from the jail. And when he was brought back, we heard from multiple folks that he was choked by a guard and then beaten by a group of trustees in another room. And we also heard from several people that the sheriff was present immediately before that happened, knew about it happening. And John was one of our key sources for that incident, and one of the few who was willing to go on the record about it, because it was so sensitive, speaking about the sheriff himself and his proximity to this conduct. So it was really our colleague Brian, who's in the back, who spoke to him for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, built a very strong relationship with John. And they were talking all the time. We have hours of tape of them. And eventually, at a certain point, John just stopped calling. We quickly found out that he'd been transferred back to the Rankin County Jail for another pending charge he had to deal with. And we waited because we had a policy of not contacting anybody who was currently in the jail, because the phone calls are being recorded. There's no way to assure that the sheriff's department is not going to know. So once he got out, we tried to contact him again, and we weren't hearing back. We were growing increasingly concerned. We reached out to an ex-girlfriend of his, and there was sort of a miraculous moment when Brian met with his ex-girlfriend just to kind of be like, hey, we're really worried about John. Do you know what's going on? And while they're sitting there, she gets a phone call, and it's John. And Brian is like, John, I've been so worried about you, man. Like, what happened? And he just sounds so downcast. And he's like, Brian, I don't know how to tell you this, man. And what comes out is that while he was at the jail, he had been brought in to the undersheriff's office, questioned about his interactions with us. And John told us that he was coerced into making a statement saying that everything he told us was essentially untrue. And it was a written statement and a verbal statement. So when we heard this, we were horrified. I mean, it's like your worst nightmare, right? We were scared for our source. We were scared for the story. We'd been working on this for months. We had dozens of people who'd spoken to us. And this key incident we'd been after for so long, we weren't sure how we were going to be able to report it. So we had to decide as a team how to approach it. And basically what we did was, after talking with John and sort of explaining to him the situation and how we were thinking about approaching it, we decided to do what we always do and report it out and try to get to the bottom of what happened in that interaction. And sat down with the department's attorney, who at first was pretty cagey about what he was willing to say. Eventually, he turned over to us the written statement that John had made, as well as a very short audio recording of John saying, I volunteer to write this. And then when it became clear that we were going to report this out and find out the full scope of what happened, he turned over a longer audio file that was also still clipped, but portrayed a version of the conversation that was tricky for us to navigate because aspects of what was in the recording matched what John had told us, but other aspects didn't.
Yeah.
And so we had to come to a determination as a team, like, how do we navigate this? We didn't want to burn our source. Everything John had told us had proven true in our further reporting in terms of all the other allegations he'd mentioned. But at the same time, we knew that the sheriff's department had this evidence that contradicted some of John's comments. And what we ended up doing after weeks of agonizing and a lot of painful discussions was finding a way to incorporate John's. We told about his allegation related to the sheriff and the escapee who was beaten only with evidence that we also corroborated with other sources and did not have him as an on-the-record source for that incident. But we also reported on what we could verify about his story of being intimidated. We couldn't share the exact details that he mentioned that we weren't able to verify, but we did describe the conversation, him being questioned, the statement, and it ended up being a closer to the story that helped communicate how the sheriff's department, upon hearing about really horrible allegations of violence, instead of trying to get to the bottom of what happened, they were questioning people who they hoped would sign statements saying that what they said was false.
Right. Thank you, Nate, for, describing, I think we talked a little bit about that last night, but just describing that entire situation. I think from it, what I'm hearing and what I would love to bring to the rest of the group is, working on these in-depth stories, you all have learned so much and developed new skills and best practices for how to report with these communities. I mean, you mentioned something that caught my eye is not doing these calls because they're recorded, or, corroborating, all of this information in a particular way. And I was just wondering, Ashley and Jean, and then Liz and John, if you could share with me, one or two things that you kind of quickly, best practices that you learned from reporting with these specific communities that you would take into reporting with vulnerable communities in the future, and also just your reporting in general. So why don't we start with Ashley and Jean, and then we'll make our way this way.
I think it's always a great reminder that not many people deal with the media and understand what it means and what they're sharing, what happens with it. So I think we learned, or I definitely learned to be very clear every single time that I was speaking with someone. And then we went through a fact checking process too, just so people understand, you told us this, we verified it with this is what is going to go in the paper. Are you okay with that? We would be speaking to one man I remember, we had many conversations with him and he understood who we worked for. We've sent him our clips, and a third or fourth conversation was, well, is what I'm telling you going in the paper? Mm-hmm. So that really stuck with me and is, I think, a really big reminder that always be clear.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that happened more than once in terms of people. You talk to them over and over, sometimes over the course of months, and they would say, this is going in the paper. So a lot of times it was asking them for a photo. And can you spell your name one more time? That kind of clicked it in their head too, because it didn't matter how many times you went over it. In terms of dealing with this particular community, it was just really helpful to remember the place they were coming from, and that the parents of these adults with, various disabilities, they lived in fear of what was happening to their kids in the group homes at night. It was not uncommon for us to hear things like, I hope I die before my child. I hope my child dies before me, which is not something you would often hear, because then I wouldn't have to worry about how they're being taken care of. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you remember the place they're coming from, you have to take it slow. You have to listen. You do it at their pace, not necessarily at your pace, which I realize in the world we live in today is sort of a luxury to take your time on something, but we wouldn't have the stories in the detail that we have them if we hadn't approached it that way.
Liz and John, same question. How did, reporting with this specific community help you develop general best practices for developing sources, for interviewing, for how you approach reporting?
Well, certainly number one is the same sort of point here, is playing the long game. Oftentimes in these situations, not even necessarily for this story, but for other similar types of stories, it's just making a connection. And the first time you talk, not like bombarding them with, will you go on camera? Okay, no, what? No, don't worry. I'm not reporting any of this. I'm just asking questions, like being very calm and just like introducing yourself to them, being yourself, letting them see like you're not a scary journalist, you're just a human. And over time, building a relationship where then they ultimately trust you and are then comfortable to share their story. So definitely taking it slow. And then I'll just give a very practical piece of advice, which is, as a TV reporter, I'm thinking in my mind about one of the interview subjects we had, who is the fiance of one of these men. Her name was Louisa, and she had been desperately looking for her loved one, her fiance, I should say, for so many months. He had been missing. He died on the streets and was taken to the center, and she did not know where he was. And she was heartbroken and horrified that her fiance was missing, and then ultimately learned about it through here. And I, just as a practical thing, we went to her home with big lights and TV cameras, and it's pretty intimidating. And I think a lot as a broadcast journalist about like what I'm wearing when I go into these settings. I would not wear, and I did not wear, a nice sort of New York City pantsuit when I went into this woman's home when she lived in a pretty low income community in a small little apartment in Dallas. I'm wearing jeans. I'm wearing something that she would feel comfortable sitting down with me and not feel like, oh, I'm intimidated by you or I'm not enough. And so I think a lot about how I present myself when I go into those communities.
Absolutely, really helpful. I think, practical advice is always incredibly helpful for the audience. I think so much of what you've said, but I think, it's such a specific nuance and a great point.
I've been thinking a lot about what Liz said in the prior question, which was when we talked about understanding the complexities of someone's life, especially somebody who ended up dying and being unclaimed. I mentioned the story of Victor Honey, and one thing for me, this may feel obvious, but I'll say it anyway, is that no judgment, because there is a temptation to think, well, Victor Honey robbed banks. I mean, what kind of main character is he going to be? But there's this broader story of his life and how, in his relation to his family, that ended up making his story stronger than every other story that we chose to make Victor Honey the lead of the story for a reason, even though he had done some things while not taking his meds that were a crime. The other thing is, I just want to reiterate, we've already heard it twice, is patience. I have to remind myself, I have to remind my editor, Julie Shapiro, we remind each other, just be patient. Like, just because this person is not calling you back or ghosting you for a few days, there's a reason that isn't that they don't like you anymore. And it's really hard to internalize that. And almost 9 times out of 10, just give them time to process it in their own way and to come around and feel some sort of agency about when they can talk about it. That's a real piece of advice that I think works almost every time. Just wait.
Absolutely. And Mukta?
I know you didn't ask me, so I'm sorry to insert
myself. Pop in there.
There was just one incident stood out in terms of what we learned going forward. Just a small anecdote. So there was this, when we were working on the chicken farm story, there was one trustee we reached out to. We spoke to him on the phone, and we were talking about, usually when we entered these conversations, we just ask general, very neutral questions about oh, what about your time as a trustee? And as we continued the conversation, we were oh, we heard that sometimes you'd also work on the chicken farm. And he was yeah, we'd work on the chicken farm. We're oh, what would you do there? And he was yeah, I'd cut grass and I'd do this and I'd do that. And after he told us this, we were well, if we write a story about this, can we use your name in the story? And he was yeah, you can use my name in the story. There was something about that conversation. I think we just got the sense that maybe he had it kind of sounded like he had an intellectual disability or something. When he was talking to us, it just, like it. He said he was like okay with being on the record, but I don't think like in that one conversation, like when we said we'd like use his name in a story, in that one conversation, I don't think we'd gone into like so much detail about what that would mean. And we were like, it's okay, you know, like he spoke to us so like openly the first time. We'll just text him back and like call him up again and just like explain it to him. And over the next few months, texted him over and over again, being like, hey, like, can we talk again? Like, by the way, like when you said we'd use your name in a story, like this is what it means. And, you know, we're really close to publishing. Like, are you sure? And can we get on the phone? And all the times we'd call him, he'd just disconnect the call. And the story deadline was getting closer. And, you know, on the one hand, like, you don't want to be like paternalistic. Like if someone says they're on the record, you know, but as we, like, given the hesitations that other people had expressed, it just felt really off to just use his name in the story and expose him like that when we hadn't gotten that confirmation. Ultimately, we decided to quote him on background. We didn't use his name. And I think we, like, after the story got published, we felt pretty good about that decision. So it's like super basic, but just like doing a gut check and making sure you can like live with your decision.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think I want to open up to audience because I want us to have time. I just wanted to say very quickly, you brought up Victor Honey, and just to me, and if anyone has any questions about this, I would encourage them. One of the most, like, to me, ethical and humane parts of all of your reporting is I feel like when I was reading, I got to genuinely know characters and subjects in your stories, and you know, you're speaking about these communities that are, you know, abused and victimized in these ways, but I was just struck by the fact that many of you, you know, included details about the lives and the people, and structured your stories in a way that highlighted the lives and the people. And so I just wanted to recognize that as just another incredibly ethical tenet of reporting with vulnerable communities. But don't have time to ask a follow-up question, but I would love to open up questions to the audience if you have any thoughts. Let's wait for the mic.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about Victor and the decision to use Victor as your centerpiece. And I'm curious for all of you, what do you look for in that killer anecdote? And when do you let it go? When do you say, you know what, this person is not the right centerpiece or the story?
I'll answer quickly because I want to hear what everyone else says. But for Victor Honey, it was actually a very sort of systemic process. My colleagues had compiled through public records requests thousands of names and thousands of bodies, connected the names to the bodies, and then we went about the very painstaking process before making any phone calls of figuring out categories of types of people that would be the best to tell the story. And really long story short, Victor was one of the people who hit a lot of our checks. He was an Army veteran. He was his body parts were used in a variety of ways, including by the Army. So he was one of the people who was the top of our list. I remember maybe a dozen people being on this list, and then came the cold calls to families. And then, as Liz mentioned, like one Facebook message to his ex-wife, and that the ease in which we were able to contact a family became another part of that checklist.
And then she was a very compelling interview. Like that would have been another part. Like there's so many things that do have to come together, because if ultimately she wouldn't go on camera or she just wasn't a great speaker, it wouldn't have made the piece the way that it would have. So it really is a combination of things that lead to it.
For us, definitely a combination of things, but we were looking for people who showed different ills of this particular system. So in the case of, for example, one young girl who died 2 days after going into a group home of a acute intoxication, we have to be careful of the wording here, of her own prescription medication, medication that was administered by staff. That opened us up to writing about all the problems with medication administration within the system, and how these very untrained people are basically acting as nurses, and how the state laws allow this. But we told her story also because, you know, there was a life that we could explain, and what promise was. She had so much promise. And I think some people write off people in the disabled community, and using her for this particular story, as we did tell the stories of other people, you know, throughout the whole series, it really helped to show how this was a loss, not just to the family, but this is a loss beyond that. And when we looked at people, we also looked to show the parts of their character that went beyond what we were hearing in the system as we went around, like what happened is their fault because of their behaviors, or, you know, the way they act, or they have autism, or they hit their head against the wall, or the injury is their own. Oh, sorry. So it helped them, you know, it helped us to just really humanize and show an issue.
I think access and documentation was also very important. Like, we were very, very lucky with the 21-year-old's parents being so willing to speak with us, tell us, share so much about what a wonderful person she was. And they had records for everything too. So they were it was a very compelling story, and we had so much to back it up and document every single claim too. So that was really, it all came together.
I'll just add, so we had the privilege of working with Dean Baquet for editing the story for the Times, and he has an interesting tendency of really wanting to reach for a newsier lead to a story rather than having an anecdote. And I think his feeling about it is like, if the story is strong enough, just saying very plainly the core idea of the story should be something that you can't tear yourself away from, and you have to keep going. Mm-hmm. We also found that, you know, we wanted to create a story that reflected the broader scope of the full allegations we were seeing. And the cases were very nuanced, and there were a lot of different dynamics in terms of why violence was being used and all kinds of things. And so we took a bit more general of approach, and then tried to, in the moments when a particular person emerged, humanize them and give a feeling for the texture of the lived experience of people just in those individual paragraphs and quotes and phrases. Like, it was a very important part of the story that we had a section where we kind of traced out what were the motivations of these trustees who were participating in this. Why would somebody do something like that? To help people understand, these were not just like people who were like, go beat this guy up, and they were willing to just do that. They were living under really difficult circumstances and put in their own ethical quandaries where there was really no good decision to make for them.
And so it felt so painful at the time, but in hindsight, it was a luxury that we were parallelly working on like an audio episode about the same reporting. And I think this was my first time working on audio, but I think the beauty of audio is that you can really like flesh out the story in a narrative way and hear people's voices and their personalities. And so while we took like I wouldn't say drier approach, but a more like direct approach about the findings for the print story, we could really like bring out the characters of the story in the episode. And when we were trying to figure out the central character for the audio episode, we were like, duh, it's John. And it was the source that Nate was talking about. He checked all the boxes. He was a member of this group of inmates that would beat other people up. He was such a great speaker. He was such a friendly guy. Like, when you listen to him, like, he was so likable. He was like a key witness for this incident. He was on the record about it. And so when we dealt with this situation of him being asked to sign this statement, it was like really difficult. But I think, again, the beauty of the podcast, like the format, is that we were able to really like flesh out his entire experience of being back in the jail and being pulled into it, and just the sound of his voice when he was talking about what happened there. So yeah, it was like the pleasure of working with two different mediums.
Let's do 1, 2. Okay, the mic is coming around just now. Oh, great.
Thank you, Bashir. So, as a journalist who focuses in vulnerable populations, so, when you interview these people, it's different than a politician, right? These people are not trying to fit their narrative into their agenda. They are being heard, and, they have sufferings and injustices. So how do you protect your mental health to go through, different people that you interview, one from one to another one? And when you finish your story, how do you reset your mind to write a new story who also will bring some also emotional pain to you as well, because we are also human beings as journalists, right?
So the year that we reported on this story, I felt like for like the first 6 or 7 months, I was like, I'm able to compartmentalize, and this is just reporting, and I'm just having conversations with my colleagues about the news that we're finding. And then I think when this incident with John Phillips happened, and just like hearing what the stakes were like for him, I think that fantasy I was living in, where I can like distinguish like my work life from like how I feel about the story, it all came like crashing down. And I think I really started like grappling with the weight of the findings that we were dealing with. Like, no, it wasn't just like conversations I was having with my colleagues about the news we'd found that day. We were like discussing really horrific incidents, and you almost like sometimes it feels like you become like desensitized to like what you're reporting on. But I think having that realization in the last few months, I think that also helped the story in a way, because this was when we were in the writing process, and I think I think it helped us like better, like just bring out like the human part of this story in a better way. The question of like how do we protect our mental health, I think it really helps having like a great team that you can talk to about everything, and like your frustrations that day, you feeling miserable and bummed out and hopeless. But I'm not quite sure I've like really mastered it yet.
Yeah,
I might get thoughts from our record team and our AC team just to get a smattering of ideas. But thank you.
I agree that a team is really helpful. Like if I was alone, if I didn't have Jean, if I didn't have my editor Jim, but I don't think I figured it out. Like it still weighs pretty heavily on me, to be honest.
Yeah, to hear some of the stories we heard and to hear them over and over again, and to be shown the pictures we were shown of burns and bruises that were, actually in the shape of a handprint. To read some of these things made it into police reports, to read them there and to sit with people for long periods of time while they were crying and go through these horrible experiences, and then to do it again with somebody else and to do it again with somebody else. I mean, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't stressful. And I couldn't have done it either without Ashley as a sounding board, and without Jim. I can think of, many times we called each other to try and figure out what the next move was, or just to vent and say, this is somebody treating me miserably who's been treating me great for months, now is lashing out at me. So I don't think I have a really good answer on how you protect your mental health, other than to just be aware of it and to lean on the people that you can.
Mr. John?
I went through a period where for a year and a half, I was doing this pretty consistently, talking to people who had this happen to them. And the thing that I struggled with was I was, I don't mean this in a pejorative way, I was almost collecting people and their trauma, starting with that first mom who called me in Mississippi. And I felt an obligation to stay in touch with them and to continue the relationship, because they kept reaching out to me for just to say hi, to maybe thank me for the work that we were doing, but also maybe ask advice. You know, we know how relationships can go. And I got overwhelmed by it at one point. I ended up getting a therapist and I went to therapy. And in therapy, I learned some of what you guys just said, which is just to talk about it, find people to talk about it, whether it be your colleagues or not your colleagues or your family, whoever it may be, and to set boundaries. That felt very harsh to me, but setting boundaries with sources at some extent to keep that from collecting. It's almost like I can't remember the term that the therapists use, but it's like you have this sort of like a secondary trauma that you're carrying for other people. Anyway, so talk about it.
We'll do one quick question to wrap it up, Chris.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. We've been talking about, you are all examples of this ethical, thoughtful reporting, and we do these stories because they need to be told. I'm going to go for the result here, though. Did anything change in Texas or New Jersey or Mississippi after these stories appeared?
Yeah, actually, and for us, it wasn't even after, which was interesting, which at first, as a journalist, was actually a little bit odd for us. We after this reporting, and John and Mike and the team, for months, trying to bring these findings to the Health Science Center, and at first, they would sort of dismiss them and deny it and stonewall, but then days before our story was set to air, or we were maybe going to air it, all of a sudden it was a Friday night, and I remember it very vividly. A statement comes in to NBC from the Health Science Center saying we are suspending the program, the body donation program entirely, and firing all of the officials who ran it. And and it was pretty. We were on one hand, we were like, it was like this. We were panicking because our story hadn't published, and we had written it not with that news at the top. So it was like I live in LA, but we wanted to do it from New York. So I got on like a red eye to New York, and you guys wrote the whole text, rewrote the text article that weekend, and I rewrote my nightly news spot, and we ended up we were like, is this not going to be as strong? But actually, in the end, somehow in the first piece, being able to come out with saying this change has been made because of the months of reporting actually made it a little bit more impactful, we think, in the end. So, yeah.
Well, New Jersey now has first ever fines against group home companies. There wasn't a way to monetarily penalize a group home. And at all of the hearings up until the governor signed it, advocates would be citing our reporting. So that was really cool. One of our other stories was about how the state doesn't use the tools it does have, like suspending admissions or closing down companies. And we found after we published our series that they took unprecedented action against 3 or 4 companies. So that was really heartening to see. So those are probably the biggest ones. Oh, and they filed criminal charges against a group home company itself, not just workers, which is pretty rare. So we're following that case.
There were also some smaller changes. They did make a move to increase transparency by changing the website. It's imperfect, but at least there was some step forward. There was also a smattering of other legislation that was introduced. There's been sort of a groundswell on changing the way the system works. A lot of people in New Jersey are looking at the model in New York of the Justice Center, so there's been a lot of movement to make some kind of change there. And then other legislation that kind of died has been brought back and is sort of working its way through the system for cameras in group homes, things like that. So we see movement on a lot of fronts. Where it's going to go, who knows? But we're hopeful, as are many of the parents we wrote about.
Do we have time? Okay.
Quickly.
So for us, we've been doing this reporting for a really long time. There's been a state law passed in Mississippi that increases police oversight. We helped spur a Justice Department investigation, which is still ongoing, even though the Trump administration has backed away from most others into law enforcement agencies. There's been multiple state and criminal investigations. Officers have been fired. I think, though, one of the things that really sticks with me, and it's really taken me years to understand this, is that in a place like Mississippi, and I think this is true of many places, but the history there of this kind of abuse runs so deep that what you're fighting can't be changed with a law and an investigation. It goes way deeper than that. And I think the thing that is much harder to communicate, but I feel much prouder of, is the fact that I've learned through my encounters with sources and residents in the area that people have really changed how they see this sheriff's department, and more importantly, how they see justice and what it looks like. What does it mean to have a safe community? I don't think that question is going to be answered in the same way in Rankin County anymore. And that's the thing I'm most proud of.
Incredible. Mukta, if you'll forgive me, I feel like that's a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much to our panelists. Watch NBC, read The Record, read Mississippi Today. And thank you all so much. Your compassionate, empathetic reporting is also incredibly impactful, and it's our pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.